Good morning. I'm very happy to welcome you this morning to an Adventures in Ideas seminar, which is our first ever Carolina Public Humanities Weekend seminar in the form of a Zoom webinar. And we are Zooming to you from the beautiful Flyleaf Bookstore in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And we are very pleased this morning to have one of our most experienced and distinguished colleagues as our speaker at this first official Adventures in Idea webinar, Professor Gerhard Weinberg. This seminar is entitled How World War II Spread Across the Globe in 1941, Africa, Russia, and the United States. And our goal is to explore how the events of this year reshaped the global framework of World War II and altered the course of the war. We're in the midst of a great upheaval at the present time, and although the COVID pandemic is not the same kind of crisis as World War II, it's like that war in that everyone's life is affected by this huge upheaval. Our situation also resembles the war in that it's a global struggle. It's causing the deaths of thousands of people in many places around the globe every day, and we have no idea when it might end. We also have fighters in every country who are working on what is often called the front lines of the struggle against the pandemic. And when you're in the midst of a great crisis, you don't have the historical knowledge that one day people will have when they describe this event and when they describe how it ended. We don't know how or when this crisis will end. And perhaps this experience gives us a certain connection with the uncertainty and fear that people felt in 1941, because they couldn't possibly know how the Great War of that time would ever end. They also were plagued by anxiety and fear and uncertainty. And it was in the year 1941 that some of the most important transitions in the war took place. But we can see that in historical retrospect. And the events of 1941 were critically important for the ultimate outcome of the conflict. I'm sure that many of you have family members whose lives were deeply affected by the events of 1941, including the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that brought the United States into the war. And we'll be talking about that event in our third session today. So the events of 1941 have left a legacy that is still with us today, and it has left a legacy that affects many of the families of the people who are watching this webinar today. So we're going to explore these events by drawing on the expertise of one of the world's leading historical scholars on this period, on the period of World War II. So before I introduce Professor Weinberg for this first session, I want to note that each session will focus on a different region of the globe, though of course all of the themes stress the connections, the interconnections of the events in each place because they were all part of a broader global war. As I've noted, and as we historians always stress, the outcome of these events were uncertain to the people who were living through them in 1941. And we have to remember this great sense of uncertainty as we talk about specific events in North Africa, in the Soviet Union, and in the Pacific Islands. Stalin was stunned by the German invasion of the Soviet Union, as most Americans were stunned and angered by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But by the end of 1941, Hitler had managed to add both the United States and the Soviet Union to the countries he was fighting, and this expansion of the war would ultimately destroy Hitler's plans for the Third Reich's vast conquest. And the crucial events of 1941 are therefore the thematic framework for today's event. So our speaker and historical guide is Professor Gerhard Weinberg, who perhaps needs no introduction to people who have been learning from him during his long career in Chapel Hill. You have received a brief biography of Professor Weinberg in your registration materials for this seminar. And you have also received a short essay that he wrote a few years ago on Hitler's views of the United States and his views of the Jews. This essay provides some important historical context for today's seminar, and if you have questions or comments about that essay, please include those in your Q&A responses, and Professor Weinberg will be happy to expand on the themes of that short paper. I want to note that Gerhard is the William Rand Keenan Jr. Professor of History Emeritus at UNC, and as many of you know, Gerhard experienced German life under the Nazis because he was living in Germany as a young child when Hitler and the anti-Semitic Nazi regime came to power. His family later moved to England, and they were eventually able to come to the United States. And Gerhard himself later joined the U.S. Army as World War II was coming toward an end. He then went to Japan in the U.S. occupation force, and he later earned his Ph.D. at the University of Chicago. Gerhard taught earlier in the history departments at the University of Kentucky and the University of Michigan before wisely coming to UNC Chapel Hill in 1974. He is one of the world's leading scholars on the history of World War II and Nazi Germany, and he has written numerous influential books, including the monumental work, A World at Arms, A Global History of World War II. This book and others by Professor Weinberg are available through orders at Flyleaf Books. In 2010, Gerhard received the prestigious Pritzker Military Library Literature Award, which is a lifetime achievement prize for excellence in military history. And that was only one of many honors that he has received over his distinguished career. He has trained generations of UNC PhD students, and he has loyal fans throughout the United States and abroad. So I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Gerhard Weinberg for this opening talk of this seminar, and it's entitled Desert Warfare and the Battle for North Africa. Professor Weinberg.
When I talk about Africa, I talk about a portion of the world that most people do not much associate with World War II, except for the Allied landing in Northwest Africa in November of '42, and they have in many cases heard about a famous German military leader by the name of Rommel. But what I would like to do is first call to your attention the fact that in World War II, excuse me, Africa is important. If you would look at the map for a moment, please notice that in 1939, at the beginning of World War II, there is only one really independent country on the continent. That's Liberia, that Americans had settled with ex-slaves. The map colors the Union of South Africa that way, but it's a British dominion at the time, and it also colors Egypt that way, but it's under British control. All the rest of the continent is under the control of different European countries. And of these, Italy was particularly interested in changing things, and as I will explain subsequently, Germany was also. Italy had gone to war with England and France in June of 1940, and it proceeded to its one great triumph of World War II. It proceeded from its colonies in Northwest Africa to conquer British Somaliland. This was a follow-up to Mussolini's earlier conquest in 1935-36 of Abyssinia. This issue will come up in a moment when we talk about the British campaign to conquer Italian Somaliland, Eritrea, and liberate Ethiopia and shove the Italians out of British Somaliland. Please note that next to it is the tiny territory which was then French Somaliland, is now an independent country. It was under the control of Vichy until 1942, and what most Americans don't realize, it is the one place in Africa where at Le Monnier there is today an American base. In 1940, the Italians from their colony of Libya in North Africa advanced into Egypt, which, as I said, was under British control. They advanced a considerable distance to a town called Sidi Barani by September of 1940, but the British proceeded to counterattack and drive them out. And not only did the British in March of 1941 drive the Italians out of Egypt, but they proceeded to advance into Libya, the Italian colony. And this intersects with two problems that Italy had. The Germans, let me see, had decided to invade the Soviet Union, a subject that I will talk about in my next talk, but in preparation for this, had moved troops into Romania. Mussolini thought that this was weird. The Germans hadn't told him the reason. And Mussolini thought that the Balkans were all going to be under Italy. He had earlier annexed Albania, and therefore in October of 1940 invaded Greece. But the Greek army defended the country successfully against the Italian invasion. And under those circumstances, Hitler decided he'd better rescue the Italians. He proceeded, in spite of planning for the invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 41, to invade Yugoslavia and Greece to rescue Italy and to follow the conquest of Greece in 41 by the conquest of the island of Crete. The Germans were successful in this, but the invasion of Crete, conducted primarily by German parachute troops, caused so many casualties to the British defenders that although they succeeded in taking the island, Hitler and his associates decided thereafter to make no more parachute attempts for offensives for the rest of World War II. And that was of critical importance because in the middle of the Mediterranean is the island of Malta. And it was clear to the Germans and Italians that that island was a major obstacle to their control of North Africa by interfering with supplies to North Africa, their forces in North Africa. And whenever they discussed the possibility of taking Malta, it always involved not just an assault by airplanes and by sea, but a parachute landing. In a sense, one could argue that the British and New Zealand and other imperial troops' defense of Crete saved Malta. And that was to provide a series, one has to say, of obstacles to the whole Italian and German campaign in North Africa. This turned out to be the German attack on Greece, turned out to be not the only time that Hitler had to rescue Mussolini. In the winter of 1940-41, the British launched a major offensive from Kenya and the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan to take over the Italian colonies in Northeast Africa, liberate the British colony that the Italians had occupied, excuse me, and free Abyssinia, Ethiopia, that the Italians had conquered before. They were successful in this, and one has to recognize that the May 1941 that the May 1941 success of the British in liberating Abyssinia from Italian control and restoring the Emperor Haile Selassie to his position in the capital, Addis Ababa, was an event that created an enormous amount of publicity all over the world. Here was an emperor who had to flee his capital. The Italians had conquered his country, and here the British had succeeded in liberating the country and restoring Haile Selassie to his throne. When under the similar circumstances, the British pushed the Italians out of Egypt, they advanced then into Libya. The situation from the German point of view was that if the British succeeded in conquering Libya, the one Italian colony in Africa that they still controlled in early 1941, it was very likely that the Italian people would dump Mussolini. The fact that as the Italians were driven back, the British captured 100,000 Italian soldiers, as they had captured 100,000 in liberating Abyssinia, led the Germans, at Hitler's directive, to send forces to reinforce and help hold the Italian position in Libya. And it's at this point in time that the famous armor commander Erwin Rommel is sent to Africa and is holding the Brits. One of the reasons that he could do this was that the British had moved some of the troops that they had in North Africa to help the Greeks. And they had done this not just because they wanted to help the Greeks and beat the Italians, but that from Greece they could bomb the Romanian oil fields, which were absolutely critical for the German war effort, and which would be a major objective of the Americans much later in the war. But you can see where, once the Brits got halfway into Libya, it was possible for the Germans to help hold them. Now, the realities of the time meant, as I've said, a fight for the central Mediterranean, because, as you could see, the Germans and the Italians could only build up forces and supply forces in Libya by crossing the central Mediterranean. And it was under those circumstances that the defense of Crete, with its imposition of enormous numbers of casualties on the German parachutists, forces that landed there, saved Malta, and thus the British ability to interfere from time to time with the supplies and reinforcements for the Germans and Italians in North Africa. As the Germans sent force to North Africa and continued to reinforce them, that has to be seen not only, as I have mentioned, as a part of Hitler's concern to save Mussolini, but also has to be seen in the context of German planning for Africa in World War II. Hitler had decided that this northern part of Africa would be Italy's colonial empire. And at the time we're talking about, there was a Boer Dutch nationalist racist government in South Africa that was very sympathetic to Nazi Germany's racist views. And the Germans who had supported the Boers against the Brits earlier figured these other pieces down there would go to South Africa. But the whole central portion, now let's see, of Africa would be Germany's colonial empire. Parts of it, Germany's Africa, Cameroons, Togo, had been German before the First World War. And the Germans were planning to take over Central Africa as a new colonial empire for Germany. And I had the rather curious experience that when I was working on my history of World War II, I found in the German Ministry of Finance records the proof coins for their African colonial empire. And at one point at a conference, had a chance to meet the ministers of finance of the by then independent countries of Tanzania, which had been Germany's Africa, and Ghana, which had been British Gold Coast. And I was pleased to tell them where they could find the coins that they would have had to use if the German plans for Africa had come on. The finance minister of Tanzania then told the two of us that there was an aspect of this that perhaps we wouldn't know. His father had fought for the Germans in East Africa in the First World War. And the finance minister from Gold Coast said that, well, perhaps you'd be finance minister anyway. And of course, the three of us then burst out laughing because no black man was going to be finance minister in a German colony. But one needs to keep in mind that from the German perspective, there were always these two aspects to the African situation. It was, from their perspective, very dangerous if the British were able not only to retake their colony, but the Italian colonies, that this would have a terrible impact for Germany by having Mussolini toppled in Italy. If instead of adding to the Italian colonial empire, he would lose what little colonial empire Italy already had when he took over in Italy in 1922, then obviously the Italian people would find a way to get rid of him. And that Hitler did not want. The other part was what I just described, the German interest in a colonial empire in the central part of Africa, from which they would draw various raw materials and where, from their perspective, the local native population would be employed in slave labor in mines and plantations producing goods for Germany. And obviously, it would be easier for Germany to acquire and hold this Central African colonial empire if Italy held and expanded its colonial empire excuse me, in North and Northeast Africa. There is some evidence that a good many people, both in the German military and in the German civilian population, was not that enthused about these African adventures. But from the perspective of Hitler and his immediate associates, reinforcing the Italian contingent in North Africa was absolutely essential. In part because some of the troops had been sent by the Brits to Greece, Rommel was successful in driving the British back out of Libya and into Egypt. And in roughly there at El Alamein, Rommel is halted by the Brits in the summer of 1941, and in late 1941 the British launch a new offensive there, because by this time they have been able to move the troops that they had used to liberate here, move them to Egypt, reinforce them in some other ways, and now once more drove the Germans and Italians into Libya. I don't want to go into the endless fighting in North Africa, but what one has to keep in mind is that in 1942 it went again the other way, with the Germans pushing the Brits back to Alamein a second time, and it was the Americans that the next time helped them out. The fighting in North Africa continues. In October of 1942, the British, for the second time, attack Rommel at Al Alamein and push him back. And by this time, in November of 42, the British and Americans have landed on this part of Africa and eventually meet in Tunisia. And what we need to keep in mind is that the fighting in North Africa continues until May of 1943. It is that far into the war, that the last German and Italian troops in North Africa surrender. From the perspective of the British, this is, of course, of great importance, but from the perspective of the Italians, this has to be seen as one of the contributing factors to the eventual dismissal and temporary arrest of Mussolini. And then the Germans liberate and establish him in a puppet government. But for the Italians to lose what colonial empire they had under the leadership of a Mussolini who was going to expand their empire. In this regard, whatever one thinks of Adolf Hitler, on that point, his assessment and the need for German assistance to keep this from happening was indubitably correct. There were other factors in the dismissal of Mussolini I don't want to go into now, but the notion that both to keep Mussolini in charge in Italy and to prepare the way for a German colonial empire in Central Africa, it wouldn't do for the enemies of Germany. And in 1941, that was primarily, of course, Great Britain, to kick the Axis powers and their forces out of Africa. And the danger that this posed from the German perspective is what meant in the end that the war in North Africa that started, if you will, with the Italian campaign to conquer British Somaliland and to invade Egypt came to be a series of efforts in which one by one forces fought back and forth in North Africa because neither side was prepared to let the other side have control of North Africa if there was any way to keep them from doing so. We know today, of course, that the Allies in the end won. But please remember that the fighting there starts in the summer of 1940 and doesn't end until May of 1943. The continent, in fact, gets involved in the war in a whole number of ways because neither side is prepared to let the other side control it without trying to prevent that. Now it's your turn for questions.
Okay, thank you. Is this microphone? So thank you very much, Gerhard, and I have a couple of questions we'll launch.
Cannot hear you, I'm sorry.
So I think I'll have to, does this help? Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay. So one of the first questions has come from one of our participants, Betty James, asking about the status of Egypt. Was Egypt, in fact, an independent country, or was it still part of the British Empire? And is that why the Brits were so eager to hold on to Egypt? Was it part of the empire, or had it achieved some kind of independence?
It was neither a part of the British Empire nor independent. It was nominally a country with its own government, its own administration, but it was under such extensive British influence that British troops were stationed there, and the government could not possibly be called truly independent. It is fair to say that from the perspective of the British, how the Egyptian government ran its internal affairs were not a matter of particular concern. But very important, Egypt's foreign policy was in effect controlled from London, not Cairo. And so, similarly, Egypt's military or defense policy was controlled by the British government. There were in the country British troops, and British here means troops from all over the British Empire. There were units there from England, from the United Kingdom. There were usually soldiers there from Australia, from New Zealand, frequently from South Africa, from British colonies like Rhodesia. We do not think of
We've lost
soldiers from New Zealand being in Egypt. But the reality was that there was this nominal independence. There was a royal family. There was an Egyptian administration. But foreign policy and defense policy were under British control.
Okay, thank you very much. So it had an importance to the British for imperial reasons, even though they didn't
Cannot
control.
hear you.
So Egypt had importance to the British for part of their imperial vision of how the empire should work.
Yes, and that was particularly critical because of the Suez Canal.
Right.
Here was the canal which, in fact, went through Egypt and was the key point for connecting to the Indian Ocean and to Australia, to India, etc. And the British were not going to take any chance on anybody other than themselves controlling that canal.
Yeah, I can see why that would make Egypt essential.
Cannot hear.
Anyway, that would make Egypt essential to the maintaining of the empire because of the Suez Canal. Okay, I have another question. Could you explain Rommel's cooperation with the SS and the plans for the final solution?
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing. What is it?
Did Rommel cooperate with the SS in any way on plans for the final solution? Did Rommel's defeat in North Africa impede plans to extend the final solution into North Africa and the Middle East?
The moment that in the summer of 1942, it looked as if Rommel could get into control of the Middle East, the Germans assigned a killing commando to be attached to Rommel's headquarters. The area of the Middle East and North Africa was to be Italian, but Hitler and the head of the German police, Himmler, were quite clear that the Italians were unlikely to slaughter the 1 million, roughly, Jews in the Middle East. So the idea was that as German and Italian troops conquered Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, and so on, a killing commando attached to Rommel's headquarters would do the systematic killing of all Jews before the territory was turned over to the Italians. And since Rommel was, at the time we're talking about, a close personal friend of Hitler's, one of the few, and he and his family were living in a house in Stuttgart that had been stolen from the Jewish community. Hitler and Himmler were quite certain that he would properly supervise the killing commando that would exterminate the, at the time, roughly 1 million Jews in the Middle East. As I mentioned, Rommel gets held and pushed back. And so while the Germans are able to kill some Jews, especially near the end of the North African campaign in Tunisia, and had the Vichy government in French Northwest Africa impose restrictions on Jews, the Italians, as an Italian regime, do not participate in the systematic killing of Jews. And the Germans, though they didn't like this, knew this and acted accordingly.
So the British success in North Africa probably saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of Jews in the Middle East.
There's no question that the British success in North Africa, assisted by the United States in 1942, when Roosevelt strips the 1st American Armored Division of its tanks and has them sent to Egypt, and orders the new Air Force shifted from India and Burma to the Mediterranean. This is what protects that, and there would be no state of Israel today if there had been no Jews in the area, if they'd all been killed as the Germans in 1942 were planning and hoping.
Okay, I want to move on. We have a lot of questions coming in now. This one from Doug Anderson.
Cannot hear the question.
Okay, I'm going to project. To what extent were the Axis logistical difficulties in the Middle East responsible for their defeat? In other words, did they have more trouble supplying their troops there and therefore less success on the battlefield?
I think it would be fair to say that they were going to lose anyway, but it would have been much more difficult and would have been longer. The Allied invasion of Europe, which starts with Sicily in July of 1943, please note, is just a few months after the Axis is cleared out of Tunisia, Africa, in May of 43. It is, I think, fair to say that if the Axis powers had not had the difficulties in supplying reinforcements and equipment and supplies, the situation in North Africa would have lasted much longer, and the invasion first into Sicily and Italy and then into France would have probably come in the subsequent year. The war would have lasted considerably longer and would have been different in two significant and easily predictable ways. Number one, the Red Army would have advanced much further into Central and Western Europe, and the first atomic bombs would have fallen on Germany as originally intended.
So this is why the North African campaign had real consequences for the later development of the war.
Oh, absolutely. It had real consequences.
Okay, I have another question. This is from our friend Jonathan Gerhard, who says, did America yet have any significant interest in Africa at this point? In other words, did the Americans get involved in North Africa because of their interest in the African continent, or simply to help the Brits?
The United States, as I will mention subsequently, is helping Britain a little, and after the Germans invade the Soviet Union in 1941, helps the Soviet Union a little. Some of that may make it a bit easier for the British to fight in North Africa. The direct intervention of the United States into the North African situation comes in two ways. The first I already mentioned, when it looks like Rommel and his forces will take over Egypt and the Middle East in the summer of 1942. As I said, President Roosevelt strips in America, the 1st American Armored Division, of its tanks and sends them, and orders General Brereton and his Far Eastern Air Force to move from India to the Middle East. So we helped there. Thereafter, we participate in two important ways. One, we agree with the British on an invasion of French Northwest Africa, which will then, in a sense, meet the British who are advancing from, or advancing this way. We will the other way and catch the Germans and Italians between, and have a base for invading Southern Europe. That is certainly important. And then we build up the 15th Air Force in the Mediterranean area, and the first major American bombing attacks onto the Romanian oil fields are from North Africa. Later on, we'll do it from Italy. But to begin with, the first big 15th Air Force attack on the German oil fields in Romania are from North Africa.
Okay, so the Americans also benefited from being able to use that as a base of operations later in the war.
Yes, we use it, of course, for the invasion first of Sicily in July of 1943, and then subsequently for the landings on Italy and the drive up the Italian peninsula from Salerno first, and then Anzio, Nettuno later on. And we tend to forget that we go to Rome, the capital of Italy, a few days before we land in Normandy in June of 1944. The one area where we vehemently disagree with the British is that Churchill wants to substitute an invasion of the Balkans, Greece, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria, for any invasion in Western Europe. And on a subject on which then President Roosevelt is in complete agreement with all of his military advisors. We will, instead of trying to invade and climb every mountain here,
Yeah.
we're going to land there. And that it also has important implications for the post-war world. The Iron Curtain, instead of going north-south from the Baltic to the Adriatic, would have gone east-west, with the Soviet Union in control of all of Germany, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, and France. We would have had Albania and Bulgaria instead on our side. And as I said, this was one area where President Roosevelt and all of his military advisors were of the same opinion, that we would bomb the Romanian oil fields, but we were not going to land there instead of in Northwest Europe.
Okay, I have a couple of other questions. There are actually a number of questions now. This one from Jackie Posner. What role, if any, did the Italian Navy play in the North African campaigns? Was there an Italian Navy involved in any of this?
There is a major Italian Navy involvement. The British, in November 1940, had launched an attack on the Italian Navy in port, which was to some extent at Taranto, which was to some extent the model that Yamamoto adopted, and we'll come to that when we talk about Pearl Harbor. But the Italian Navy sometimes succeeds alongside German submarines and Italian submarines in damaging and sinking British ships. They also have special underwater individuals who go into Alexandria and badly damage some British warships. So the Italian Navy plays a significant part, and we tend to forget that in 1939 the Italians had more submarines than the Germans, and they play an important role in attacking British shipping in the Mediterranean and other Allied ships in the North Atlantic. So there is an Italian Navy which plays some role, but it is also much damaged by the British.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of questions here about Hitler's role in the North African campaign. Did Hitler himself play an active strategic role in the campaign, given the fact he was now, after 1941, involved with the Soviet Union? How much did Hitler pay attention to North Africa? And the related question from someone else, did Hitler's use of opiates beginning in the fall of 41 affect his involvement in strategic activities in North Africa?
Hitler is very much interested in the North African campaign. He sent Rommel there quite deliberately. He does what he can to reinforce. And while obviously his most important campaign from the summer of 41 on is the Eastern Front, that's where most German troops are, the majority, he invariably watches very closely the development of the campaign in North Africa. And it was, ironically, this very close attention and the orders that he gave Rommel in the summer of 42 and again in 43 on the campaign that turns Rommel eventually against Hitler. And so after the attempt on Hitler's life, Rommel is given the choice of committing suicide or a public trial. And Rommel commits suicide, and his family is spared. But there's no question that Hitler pays very close attention to the campaign in North Africa. It is fair to say that he doesn't pay that much attention to the campaign in Northeast Africa between the British and the Italians. But the campaign in North Africa between the Italians and Germans on the one hand and the British and subsequently the Americans on the other side, Hitler follows very closely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Here's another related question. When the Italians and Germans finally surrendered in 1943, this last
Yes.
group, how many Italian and German troops became POWs? This is from
At the time, in May of 43, the surrender here in Tunisia to the British and American forces there is roughly 300,000 men, of whom at least 100,000 are German, maybe more, and the others are Italian forces. But it's a very large army.
So where were these POWs taken?
Some of them are kept in North Africa, but some of them are brought to the United States.
Really?
We tend to forget that by this time, as we are sending troops to North Africa, to Italy, and to England for the invasion in 44, the ships on their way back often bring Italian and German POWs. And I'm not sure that includes, but as you may know, a goodly number of German POWs are brought to the western part of North Carolina in the war. And so there are substantial numbers of Italian and German POWs brought to this country.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So there's a North Carolina connection right there.
I'm sorry.
I said, so there's a North Carolina connection to the North African campaign.
Oh, yes.
So here is another question. This may come to a more contemporary question. With the history of Somaliland, do you see growing risks now with the Chinese coming in to create military bases there?
I'm sorry.
There's a question about whether there are parallels to the contemporary situation now with the Chinese coming into East Africa.
Yes, ironically, the American base that I mentioned at Le Monnier in what used to be French Somaliland is very close to a Chinese base. They are now very much and increasingly involved in Africa, both by trade, Chinese by credits, and as I said, a base that is practically next door to the American base.
So this is where 1941 is still linked to 2020.
Yes.
A base.
Yes. Oh,
and
yes.
The Chinese are now next door. So
yes.
Here, this is a question from our good friend Paul Connick, who has been reading your essay from your talk that was distributed in advance. And Paul asks about parallels. He says, you note that the Nazi policies turned many Americans against the Germans in the 1930s. And we now know that despite that, Americans remained isolationist in the 1930s. So, do you see any parallels between the isolationism of pre-World War II America and the current attitudes in America today? Do you see a parallel between the 1930s and today?
There is a certain amount of parallel, as I will mention when we get to the last of our talks about the United States. The United States, the majority of the people in 1920 decided to stop the earth and get off. And that doesn't change substantially until the Second World War. But that is now a very long time ago. And there is, at least in some areas and with some people in this country today, an attitude that reflects or is somewhat similar to the attitude in the 1920s and the 1930s, that we should mind our own business, not be involved elsewhere, and let these other people mind their business, and if they do it badly, that's their problem, not ours. So there is a somewhat, both in the public and in our government, not a return, but an echo, somewhat similar of that. There cannot be any doubt, in my mind at least, that the policies that the Germans and Italians were following in the 1930s, and especially in 39 and 40 and 41, disturbed large numbers of Americans and did raise some issues as to what the United States could and should do, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. But we would certainly not have entered the war on the Allied side if the Axis powers had not insisted.
Okay, thank you. This is a question coming from, it says, a Tar Heel outpost in Starkville, Mississippi, okay, from Jim Leggett. What role did oil play in the calculations of all the parties in North Africa? In other words, was oil one of the main considerations in the North African campaign?
Oil played two roles. One was, of course, that for each side they had to ship oil. But the oil at the time was available primarily from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, in other words, from the Middle East. And the assumption of the Axis powers was that this was the oil that Italy would have for its military, while the Germans were going to get their oil from conquering the Soviet Union and get it from primarily the Caucasus oil fields. From the perspective of the Allies, what was important was that they were getting the oil of the Middle East. That is to say, the British in particular were dependent on oil from the Middle East. And while the United States had some of its own and got some from parts of Central America, we were getting some oil from the Middle East. The notion of the United States exporting oil is a matter of the last 20 years. That was not a situation at the time that we're talking about. And so the oil issue was very considerable importance at the time we're talking about for the British on the one side and the Germans and Italians on the other.
Okay, thank you. Here is another question that builds on a comment you made earlier about Churchill's desire to go up through Greece and Bulgaria. The question is, do you think there was a racial element in wanting to control the post-war region of Northern Europe instead of the Southeast Balkans? Would there have been a racial component of Roosevelt's desire to control Northern Europe rather than Southeastern Europe?
I've never seen the slightest trace of that. From the perspective of Americans, Greeks and French, Bulgarians and Belgians were similar people. There is no racial issue there. The issue why we wanted, not just the president, but all the top military wanted to go into Western Europe was that, number one, it was closer. Number two, the terrain was better. And number three, that if we were going to have some say about the post-war situation, we had to get into Germany. And if you will look at that map, it's a long way from Albania to Germany. We were going to get into Germany if we landed in the West.
Right.
And I think it's also fair to say that there was this concern about having the Soviet Union on the other side of the Atlantic from the United States in the post-war world. And so that looked geographically and militarily much the better procedure, and we insisted long enough and quite literally forced the British to come along.
That was a good decision, I think. Here is another question. This is from Jan. How much support did the Axis powers have in North Africa as compared to the Allies? In other words, were there collaborators in North Africa as there were in France or in other areas where the Axis powers operated?
There was some, well, of course, Vichy France was collaborating with the Germans, and they collaborated and fought against the British when they took over Syria in the spring of '41, and they killed lots of Americans when they landed in North Africa in November of 1942. Vichy France collaborated with the Germans quite a bit. As far as the local population, the indigenous population, there was relatively little collaboration, because to them, the Italians and the Germans were about as foreign as the British and the French and the Americans, and there was not a kind of sense of great preference either way. These were different people with different habits, languages, and customs. And so there was not any very substantial
Yeah.
indigenous collaboration.
So it might have looked like one colonial power competing with another colonial
Yes.
power. That's basically what
That's the way it looked to them.
So here is another question related to your essay about Hitler's vision.
Yes.
In your essay, you stressed his idea of not only conquering to the east, but conquering the United States.
Yeah.
How important was Africa in his vision of global conquest?
In the world conquest notion, Hitler thought of Africa as an exploitive area for some raw materials and things that Germany would need. And therefore, as I mentioned, there was going to be this Central African German colonial empire where the local people would be subordinate and engaged primarily in slave labor in mines and on farms. But the major military concerns were to the east and to the west, never to the Central African colonial empire, which would come more or less as an extension after the Italians got their North African colonial empire. And there, a racial element undoubtedly plays a critical part. The assumption that these people are racially inferior and easily conquerable by the Germans, so you don't have to worry much about them.
So how would you compare the racism and the attitudes, the anti-Semitism of Hitler with his view of the Africans, the black Africans? Was there a comparable, was there a racist hierarchy in Hitler's ideology?
Yeah, there was a racial hierarchy, but the Jews were below the Africans because they were not only inferior, they were also dangerous. And all 18 million on Earth at the time had to be killed. The Africans did not have to be killed. They were inferior. They would be put to work. And they could dig in mines. They could grow plants. They could work. The settlement of Germans was, at least for the first millennium or two of the German Empire, was to the east, where the Slavic peoples would be replaced by German settlers. As to the best of my knowledge, while there would be a ruling Germanic elite in the Central African colonial empire, the local people would not be systematically exterminated. It was unlike the Jews, who were to be systematically exterminated all over the globe. The Central African indigenous population were to be slave laborers. And ironically, it is the one area, one of the few areas, where he got into a serious argument with his top military advisors like Keitel, Jodl, and others. And that is his insistence that none of them be ever armed of the local people. And in this regard, he went very strongly against the German emphasis on the Askaris, the local population people who had fought for Germany in East Africa in the First World War, and who were native East Africans, not just Germans. And so on that issue, there was a real long-running argument between Hitler and his top military associates, but neither of them ever thought of the notion of systematically killing the indigenous people. The argument is whether any of them should ever be armed.